The stars had never looked like this. That was Petty Officer Dale. Hutchins's first thought as he stepped out onto the weather deck of USS Iowa for his watch rotation at 0400, coffee in hand. The Pacific somewhere beneath them, or at least, it had been the Pacific. The water was gone. The salt smell was gone. The distant rumble of fleet traffic on the horizon was gone. What remained was silence of a kind Dale had never encountered in 3 years of naval service. And above him, a sky so thick with stars it looked like someone had spilled a bucket of diamonds across black velvet and forgotten to clean it up. He dropped his coffee. The mug hit the deck with a clang that echoed across a sea that wasn't there. Because there was no sea. USS Iowa, all 887 feet and 45,000 tons of her, was floating in open space. In the Combat Information Center, chaos had a very specific sound. It sounded like Commander Harris shouting over 17 men talking at once, none of their instruments making any sense, and the ship's intercom crackling with reports from every deck simultaneously. Reports that all said the same impossible thing. We are not in the water. Captain John McCormick was a man who had earned his command through two qualities the Navy prized above almost everything else: an ability to absorb catastrophic information without losing his voice, and a talent for making decisions when no decision seemed survivable. He had commanded Iowa through the Marshall Islands campaign. He had stood on this bridge while Japanese shells walked toward his waterline and hadn't flinched. He stood now at the forward viewport, a viewport that should have shown him dark, Pacific swells and the distant lights of the task force, and looked out at the void between stars. And he did not flinch then either. "All stop," he said quietly. "Sir, the engines." "I know what the engines do, son. All stop. Let's find out where we are before we decide where we are going." The order traveled through the ship. Iowa's massive propellers slowed in water that wasn't there, and gradually the great ship settled into stillness, hanging in the void like a grey iron island. McCormick turned to his executive officer, Commander Frank Reeves, a lean Virginian with the permanent expression of a man doing math in his head. "Frank, talk to me." "Sir, I have no idea." Reeves said it like a confession. "Our compasses are useless. Radio is picking up signals but nothing I recognize. No fleet traffic, no weather stations. Nothing from Pearl. The signals we are getting." He paused, holding a headset out slightly, as if it might explain itself. "They're not in any language I've ever heard. Some of them might not be human." McCormick absorbed this. Navigation. Dead reckoning is meaningless without reference points. We have stars, but the constellations don't match any chart aboard this ship. "Which means we are either very far from where we started," McCormick said, "or very far from when we started." Reeves stared at him. "I'm not saying I understand it, Frank. I'm saying we account for every possibility." McCormick moved to the viewport again, hands clasped behind his back, and studied the stars with the patient intensity of a man who had spent his career reading water and weather for threats, battle stations. Quietly, "I don't want panic, I want readiness. Post lookouts on every deck. Get the gunnery crews to their stations but do not load the main batteries yet. And somebody get me whoever is picking up those signals. I want ears on everything this ship can reach." "Aye, Captain." Iowa hummed with controlled purpose. That was the thing about a well-trained crew. They didn't need to understand a situation to respond to it. They needed clear orders and trust in the man giving them. McCormick had both to offer, and the men took them and moved. 14 light-years away, the USS Venture, a Federation ambassador class starship on a routine survey patrol near the Badlands perimeter, received a sensor contact that made Lieutenant Commander Sorrell stop mid-sentence during his duty report. "Commander," said the ensign at the operations console, "I'm reading a massive metallic object at coordinates 227 Mark 14. It just appeared. Appeared. No warp signature. No impulse trail. No subspace distortion consistent with cloaking. It simply registered. One moment nothing, then." She gestured at her display. "That." Sorrell crossed to the console and studied the readings with the deliberate calm of a half-Falcon who had learned that expressing confusion was rarely useful. What the sensors showed him was extraordinary. The object was enormous, nearly 270 meters in length, roughly 33 meters at the beam, composed almost entirely of iron, carbon steel, and what appeared to be early 20th century earth alloys. It was generating low-level electromagnetic fields consistent with combustion-based propulsion. It had no deflector shields, no phaser banks, no torpedo systems. It had, however, 9 very large gun barrels. "Can you identify it?" he asked. The ensign pulled up the Federation Historical Database and cross-referenced hull configuration, alloy composition, and propulsion signature. The result came back in seconds. "Sir," she said, and her voice carried a note of pure bewilderment, "the computer identifies this as an Iowa-class battleship. United States Navy. Earth origin." She looked up. Construction date approximately 1940. It should not exist anymore. The last Iowa-class vessel was decommissioned and preserved as a museum. Ship in the early 21st century. Sorrell straightened. "Hailing frequencies." "Open, sir. Though I'd note their communication technology is radio wave based. We'll need to modulate down significantly." "Do so." He folded his hands and addressed the channel. "Unidentified vessel, this is Commander Sorrell of the Federation Starship Venture. Please identify yourself and state your point of origin. We are transmitting on multiple frequencies and offer no hostile intent." Across 14 light-years and 400 years of history, the response came back crackling and raw, filtered through equipment that had been cutting edge in another century. "This is Captain John McCormick, United States Navy, Commanding Officer USS Iowa. 2. Whoever or whatever is receiving this, we are not in a hostile posture. But I will tell you plainly, we are armed. We are alert, and we will defend this vessel and her crew. If your intentions are peaceful, so are ours. We would appreciate knowing where in God's name we are." Sorrell considered the voice, calm, measured, clearly military, and carrying the unmistakable cadence of mid-20th century American English. He turned to his communications officer. "Inform Starfleet Command that we have made contact with an anachronistic Earth vessel of significant historical importance." He paused. "And note in the log that the crew appears to be handling their displacement with remarkable composure. If you want to see more wild, historical and fictional crossovers, land in strange galaxies and stranger centuries, hit that subscribe button and drop in the comments what vessel or character you'd want to see next. May the Force and the stars be with you." Captain McCormick had spent 20 minutes listening to Commander Sorrell's explanation. He had listened the way he listened to everything, without interrupting, without visible reaction, with the focused stillness of a man who understood that information, however uncomfortable, was always preferable to ignorance. He had asked 3 clarifying questions. He had requested that certain things be repeated. And when Sorrell finished explaining that Iowa had been pulled through a spatial temporal anomaly into the 24th century, approximately 400 years beyond her own time, into a galaxy populated by dozens of intelligent species, governed by a democratic interstellar federation, and currently existing in a period of significant political tension with multiple hostile powers. McCormick had been quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "And your federation. You're the good guys." Sorrell had paused at that. "We endeavor to be, Captain, though I would note that such designations are rarely as clean as they appear from the outside." McCormick had appreciated that answer more than he would have appreciated a simple yes. The Venture moved to within visual range of Iowa slowly and with deliberate care, dropping to 1/4 impulse and broadcasting her approach on every frequency. McCormick had ordered Iowa's main battery turrets trained forward, not raised, not loaded, but visible. A professional courtesy between armed vessels. "I see you. You see me. Let's talk before anyone does anything irreversible." The crew of the Venture gathered at every available viewport. Word had spread through the ship within minutes of first contact. because word always spread through starships regardless of protocol. And what the crew saw when Iowa finally resolved on their screens was something that produced an almost universal reaction of stunned silence, followed by something approaching reverence. She was ancient by every measure that mattered in the 24th century. Her hull was grey steel, scarred and salt-stained from a Pacific campaign that was now half a millennium in the past. Her superstructure rose in the tiered, functional architecture of an era when warships were built to absorb punishment rather than avoid it. Her 3 main turrets, each housing 3 16-inch guns, sat along her center line like the knuckles of a closed fist. She had no engines that could move her faster than light, no shields that could deflect an energy weapon, no sensors that could detect a cloaked vessel. She was, by every tactical metric of the 24th century, hopelessly primitive. She was also, somehow, magnificent. Ensign Yara Chen, 23 years old and 4 months out of the academy, said what most of her colleagues were thinking: she's beautiful. The veteran chief petty officer standing beside her said nothing, but he nodded once, slowly, in the way of someone acknowledging a truth that surprised them. McCormick came aboard the Venture via shuttle, a process that required Iowa's crew to lower a boat from davits while Venture's personnel watched with expressions ranging from fascination to barely concealed awe. He brought Reeves and his senior gunnery officer, Lieutenant Commander Walsh, a broad-shouldered Chicagoan who had been suspiciously calm about the entire situation and who McCormick suspected had simply decided to treat the 24th century as a particularly unusual deployment. Sorrell met them in the shuttle bay. The 2 commanders regarded each other across the bay with a measuring look of professional military men conducting rapid mutual assessment. McCormick noted the pointed ears, the precise stillness, the complete absence of nervous energy. Sorrell noted the iron posture, the eyes that catalogued everything without appearing to. The way McCormick's hand never strayed far from a sidearm that was, Sorrell calculated, approximately as dangerous to a 24th century combatant as a strongly worded letter. Commander Sorrell. McCormick extended his hand. Captain McCormick. Sorrell shook it with the firm, businesslike grip of someone who had learned human customs thoroughly. Welcome to the 24th century. I regret the circumstances. I've had worse welcomes, McCormick said. Walk me through what you know about how we got here, and then tell me what happens next. What happened next, as it turned out, was a Klingon patrol. The IKS Rotaran, not the famous one, but a bird of prey of the same class operating under Commander Koth, a squat and perpetually irritated warrior who had been patrolling this sector for 6 weeks and found nothing worth fighting, decloaked approximately 40,000 kilometers off Iowa's port beam, with the casual aggression of a species that considered subtlety a personal failing. On Iowa's bridge, the appearance of the Klingon vessel, shimmering into existence from nothing, angular and predatory, utterly unlike anything in any recognition. Manual aboard the ship produced a controlled eruption. Lookouts reported it simultaneously from 3 decks. The gunnery crews were at their stations within 90 seconds. Main battery turrets began tracking automatically, because the men operating them were professionals, and a ship appearing from nowhere off the port beam was, regardless of century, a threat to be addressed. Koth hailed on a frequency that the Venture quickly relayed and translated. Federation vessel. What is this iron object? It reads as no known ship. Explain or we will investigate by force. Sorrell, still in conference with McCormick, moved quickly to the bridge. McCormick followed without being asked, because it was his ship being discussed, and he had not survived 2 years of Pacific combat by staying out of rooms where decisions were being made about him. Sorrell opened the channel. Commander Koth. The vessel is an Earth ship, historically significant, currently under Federation observation. We ask that you maintain distance while. It has weapons trained on my ship, Koth interrupted. The translation carried his displeasure adequately. Nothing trains weapons on a Klingon vessel and survives the conversation. McCormick looked at Reeves, who had followed him aboard and was monitoring a handheld radio-linked Back to Iowa's bridge. Turrets are still tracking, Reeves murmured. Gunnery says they locked on the moment it appeared. McCormick leaned slightly towards Sorrell's open channel. Commander, with your permission. Sorrell considered him for approximately 1 second. Captain. McCormick addressed the channel directly. This is Captain John McCormick, commanding USS Iowa. Your vessel appeared without warning off my port beam. My guns track threats automatically. That's not aggression, that's seamanship. If you're not a threat, pull back to a courteous distance and my crew will stand down. If you are a threat, he paused, and his voice carried the particular quality of a man who has said this kind of thing before and meant it every time. I'd encourage you to reconsider. We may be a long way from home, but we brought everything we need. The channel was quiet for 4 seconds. Then Koth's voice returned, and there was something in it that hadn't been there before. Not respect, exactly, but the specific recalibration of a warrior who has just heard another warrior speak and has revised his initial assessment upward. You speak plainly for a Federation man. I'm not a Federation man, McCormick said. I'm United States Navy. It's a distinction. I'll explain if you give me the time. Another pause. Then, stand your gunners down and I will maintain distance. For now. McCormick nodded to Reeves, who spoke quietly into the radio. On Iowa, the turrets eased back to center line. Sorrell observed all of this with the expression of a man watching something unexpected occur and filing it carefully for later analysis. Captain, he said quietly, you may find the 24th century more navigable than you expect. Or less, McCormick replied. But we'll manage either way. Through the viewport, Iowa hung in the dark between the Venture and the Klingon bird of prey, grey and massive and thoroughly out of her century. And she looked, to anyone watching, like she had always belonged exactly where she was. Starfleet Command received Sorrell's report at 0347 hours. San Francisco time, which meant Admiral Nora. Satie was woken from sleep by an aide, who had the good sense to look apologetic about it. She read the report twice. Then she read it a third time, because the first 2 readings had produced conclusions she wanted to verify were actually in the document and not symptoms of insufficient sleep. An Iowa-class battleship, mid-20th century, full crew complement of approximately 2,700 men, displaced through a spatial-temporal anomaly of unknown origin, currently stationary in Sector 441, under observation by the Venture. Crew status, alert, organized, armed, and apparently in better psychological condition than any temporal displacement. Protocol predicted for pre-warp humans, encountering the 24th century for the first time. She put the report down and looked at her aide. Get me the Temporal Mechanics Division, the Historical Preservation Office, and someone from the Judge Advocate General's office. The JAG office, Admiral. These men are United States Navy personnel from 1944. They are technically foreign nationals from a sovereign nation that no longer exists, operating a vessel that is simultaneously a museum piece and an active warship, inside Federation space, without a treaty, without authorization, and apparently with enough firepower to make a Klingon bird of prey back down. She picked up her coffee. I want a lawyer. The conference room aboard Starbase 47 was designed for diplomatic summits and therefore had very good chairs, excellent lighting, and a replicator that could produce coffee in approximately 30 different historical styles. McCormick accepted a cup of what the replicator called 1940s American Diner blend and found it surprisingly accurate. He filed this away as evidence that the future, whatever else it was, had its priorities reasonably well organized. Across the table sat Admiral Satie, 2 members of her staff, a Vulcan temporal mechanics specialist named Tvora, and a JAG commander named Reinhold, who had the expression of a man who had prepared extensively for this meeting and was already certain his preparation was inadequate. McCormick had brought Reeves and Walsh. He had considered bringing more but decided that a larger delegation signaled either insecurity or aggression. and he wanted to project neither. Sati studied him with the frank assessment of a senior officer who had negotiated with Romulans and wasn't easily impressed. Captain McCormick, I'll be direct with you. I'd appreciate it, Admiral. Starfleet's position on temporal displacement is complicated. Officially, we are required to minimize interaction with displaced persons from earlier historical periods to avoid contaminating the timeline. Practically, you are sitting in my conference room with 2,700 men, a warship I cannot legally impound and cannot practically ignore, and no clear mechanism for returning you to your own time. She folded her hands, which means we have a situation. We've been in situations before, McCormick said. Not like this one. No, he agreed. Not like this one. Tvora, the temporal mechanic specialist, leaned forward. She had the precise, economical manner of a Vulcan who had decided that pleasantries were a negotiable luxury. Captain, the anomaly that displaced your vessel has been analyzed from the Venture's sensor records. It was not a natural phenomenon. The energy signature is consistent with a forced subspace compression event, something artificially generated. McCormick's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. Someone pulled us here. That is the most probable conclusion, yes. Who and why, we do not currently know. Which means, Reeve said quietly from McCormick's left, we are not just lost. We are bait, or a weapon, or a message. Tvora regarded him with something approaching approval. Commander Reeves. Yes. One of those three possibilities is almost certainly correct. The room was quiet for a moment. Reinhold, the JAG commander, seized the pause to insert the question he had been building toward. Captain, I need to address the legal status of your vessel and crew within Federation space. You are operating weapons systems that, while historically primitive, constitute a legitimate military threat. Federation law requires. Commander. McCormick's voice was courteous and final simultaneously, the specific tone of a man who respects process while making clear that process has limits. With respect, my crew did not ask to be here. We were taken from our time, from our ocean, from our war, and yes, we have a war to get back to, which is a fact I'd like everyone in this room to keep in mind. I am not interested in being impounded, decommissioned, studied, or legislated. I am interested in understanding what happened to my ship, finding a way home if one exists, and keeping my men safe in the meantime. He set his coffee down. Now, if the Federation wants to be helpful with any of those three things, I am a willing partner. If the Federation wants to be an obstacle, I will be respectful, but I will not be cooperative. Are we clear? Sati looked at him for a long moment. Then something shifted in her expression, not softening exactly, but the recognition of a particular kind of officer, the kind that institutions produced rarely and were always slightly uncomfortable having around. Clear, she said. Let's talk about what helpful looks like. What helpful looked like, it turned out, involved Iowa being assigned a Federation liaison officer, access to Starbase 47's repair and supply facilities with modifications, adapted for 20th century systems, and a temporary operational status that Reinhold described as provisional, humanitarian accommodation and that McCormick described to Reeves afterward as they don't know what to do with us, so they're being polite about it. The crew of Iowa, for their part, were adapting with a speed that continued to surprise the Starfleet personnel assigned to observe them. This was partly because men who had survived the Marshall Islands, Letta Gulf, and the Okinawa campaign had already demonstrated a capacity for absorbing the unprecedented and continuing to function, and partly because Iowa's crew were, at their core, professionals who had been trained to operate their ship and follow their captain. And their captain was operating and following made sense, so they operated and followed. There were adjustments. The first time a holographic display activated in a corridor without warning. 3 petty officers hit the deck and 1 drew a sidearm. The replicators produced a theological debate in the mess that lasted. for days and was never fully resolved. The universal translator, once calibrated to mid-20th century American English, worked adequately but produced occasional anachronisms that caused confusion. On both sides, the translator rendered Klingon accurately, but consistently translated their honorifics in ways that sounded like 1940s sports commentary. Walsh, the gunnery officer, had taken a different approach entirely. He had requested and received access to Federation weapon specifications, not to copy them, but to understand the tactical environment his guns would be operating in. He spent 3 days reading, calculating, and building what he called a picture of 24th century combat geometry. What he found both relieved and concerned him. It relieved him because Iowa's 16-inch guns fired projectiles at velocities and with energies that Federation shield harmonics had not been specifically calibrated to resist. The shields were designed for energy weapons, phasers, disruptors, plasma torpedoes, a 2,700-pound armor-piercing shell traveling at 2,500 feet per second was a fundamentally different problem, one that shields could handle but not dismiss. It concerned him because everything else in the 24th century could hit Iowa from ranges and angles her own sensors couldn't detect, at speeds her guns couldn't track, with weapons that could penetrate her belt armor without difficulty. "We are a glass cannon," he told McCormick. "We can hurt things that don't expect us. Anything that knows we are coming and has time to prepare will take us apart." "Then our job," McCormick said, "is to make sure nothing has time to prepare." It was the right answer. Walsh nodded and went back to his calculations. 12 hours later, the Starbase's long-range sensors detected a gem, her DAR attack wing, moving on a heading that would intercept a Federation supply convoy and a small, undermanned outpost on Keswick for that had no idea what was coming. McCormick was informed as a courtesy. He was not asked for anything. He found Admiral Sartee in the Operations Center. "How many ships do you have in range to intercept?" "One," she said. "The Venture. It won't be enough." McCormick was quiet for 3 seconds. "How far is Keswick for?" "At Iowa's maximum speed." Sartee did the math. "Too far. You'd arrive after the attack." "Adventure's speed towing Iowa on a tractor beam." Sartee stared at him. "We can't fight a running battle," McCormick said. "But if the Venture gets us there fast and drops us in their path." He left the sentence where it was. Sartee looked at the tactical display, then at McCormick, then back at the display. "Commander Sorrell will not like this plan," she said. "No," McCormick agreed. "But he'll do it. He's a professional." The tractor beam locked onto Iowa at 1,400-hour station time, and the sensation aboard the Battleship was unlike anything in the ship's considerable history. It wasn't uncomfortable exactly. It was more like being held, the specific, slightly unnerving feeling of something vast and invisible wrapping itself around 45,000 tons of steel and simply deciding where that steel was going to be. The hull groaned in places, not from stress but from the novelty of forces it had never been designed to accommodate. Down in engineering, Chief Petty Officer Makovsky stood with his arms crossed and watched his pressure gauges with the focused disapproval of a man who had not consented to any of this and wanted the gauges to know it. On Iowa's bridge, McCormick watched the stars begin to move and said nothing. Reeves stood beside him. "You know there's a real possibility this doesn't work." "There's a real possibility everything doesn't work," McCormick said. "That's never stopped us before." "The Jem'Hadar," Reeves said carefully. "Sorrell's briefing. They don't take prisoners. They don't negotiate. They exist to fight and they're very good at it." "So do we," McCormick said. "And so are we." Commander Sorrell had not liked the plan. He had said so with characteristic Vulcan precision, outlining 17 specific tactical, logistical, and probabilistic objections in the time it took McCormick to finish his second cup of coffee. He had noted that Iowa's maximum effective gun range, while impressive by historical standards, was a fraction of standard 24th century combat engagement distances. He had noted that the battleship carried no shields, no point defense systems capable of intercepting Jem'Hadar fighters, and no warp capability of her own. He had noted that the plan required the Venture to position itself within optimal Jem'Hadar firing range for approximately 4 minutes during the drop-off, which he calculated as unacceptably dangerous. Then he had approved the plan, because Sorrel was, as McCormick had correctly identified, a professional. And the professional calculus was straightforward: 1 undermanned outpost, 1 supply convoy, 1 Federation starship insufficient to the task, and 1 anachronistic battleship whose capabilities had not been fully tested against 24th century opposition. The logical response to insufficient data was to gather more data. The most efficient way to gather more data about Iowa's combat effectiveness was to put Iowa in combat. The Venture jumped to warp with Iowa in tow and the stars stretched into lines. Walsh had his gunnery crews at stations for the entire transit. He had also, in the 12 hours since Sati's operation center, done something that McCormick considered either brilliant or completely insane, which in his experience were often the same thing. He had requisitioned, through the Federation liaison officer, a young Boolean named Tia V who was earnest and helpful and slightly terrified of Walsh, every sensor reading available on Jem'Hadar fighter combat profiles, speed, maneuverability, attack patterns, preferred engagement ranges, shield harmonics, weapons cycling rates. He had then sat down with his senior gun crews and translated all of this into the only tactical language they actually spoke: fire control tables, bearing calculations, deflection shooting, and the ancient, reliable mathematics of putting a projectile where a moving target was going to be, rather than where it currently was. The Jem'Hadar fighters, his analysis showed, were fast and aggressive and almost entirely committed to direct attack runs. They did not use the kind of evasive maneuvering that would make deflection shooting truly difficult. They came in hard and straight, because their doctrine was built around the assumption that their shields and speed made evasion unnecessary. Walsh had fought Japanese aircraft for 2 years. Japanese pilots had also been fast, aggressive, and committed to direct attack runs. He explained this to his crews without drama. He told them what they were facing, what it could do, and what he expected them to do about it. Then he told them to get some sleep on their stations if they could, because they'd need it. Most of them did, because they were Iowa's crew, and Iowa's crew trusted Walsh, and Walsh had never yet told their guns to fire at something they couldn't hit. The Venture dropped out of warp at the edge of the Keswick system, with 4 minutes to spare. The Jem'Hadar attack wing was already visible on sensors, 6 fighters in attack formation, moving on the outpost at combat speed, confident and direct and entirely unprepared for what was sitting in their path. Iowa, released from the tractor beam, hung in space between the Jem'Hadar and Keswick 4. She turned slowly, ponderous and deliberate, bringing her main battery to bear, with the unhurried authority of something that has never needed to rush because it has always been the largest thing in the room. On the lead Jem'Hadar fighter, the sensor operator reported the contact to his first. The first looked at the reading. It showed a large metallic vessel with no energy weapons, no shields, no warp signature. It showed 9 large cylindrical protrusions that his database did not recognize. It is not a threat, the first said. He was incorrect. Walsh fired a ranging shot first. Single gun, turret 2, armor-piercing round. The shot was not aimed to hit. It was aimed to tell him what he needed to know about how his fire control needed to adjust for the absence of atmosphere, gravity, and the other variables that 20th century gunnery tables had been built around. The round crossed the void at 2,500 feet per second and passed close enough to the lead fighter to register on its sensors as a near miss. The Jem'Hadar formation reacted the way aggressive direct attack fighters always reacted to unexpected fire from an unexpected direction. They turned toward it. Walsh had been counting on that. Full broadside, he said quietly. Fire. Iowa spoke. All 9 16-inch guns fired in a staggered sequence that Walsh had calculated to maximize the spread across the incoming formation. The sound, inside the ship, was a physical thing, a sequence of concussive hammers that traveled through the hull and into the bones of every man aboard. Outside, in the silence of space, there was no sound. There was only light, 9 simultaneous streaks of fire crossing the void. And then the results. 3 of the 6 Jem'Hadar fighters ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. Their shields absorbed the first fraction of a second of energy transfer from a 2,700-pound projectile traveling at the relevant velocity. And then the shields collapsed and the projectile continued. Because the projectile did not care about shields. It cared about mass and velocity, and the fundamental physics of kinetic energy transfer, none of which had changed between the 20th and 24th centuries. The remaining 3 fighters broke formation, which was, tactically, the correct response. It was also, from Walsh's perspective, the expected response. Reload. Track the breakouts. Fire at will. Iowa's gun crews moved with the rhythm of men who had drilled this evolution 10,000 times. The great turrets traversed. The guns elevated. The breaches opened and closed with mechanical certainty. The Venture, hovering at the edge of the engagement, had initially moved to provide fire support. Sorrel watched his tactical display with the expression of a Vulcan, confronting data that required significant revision of prior assumptions, and he quietly told his tactical officer to hold fire. Iowa did not need help. The 4th fighter took a single 16-inch shell through its port nacelle and tumbled into a decaying spiral that would eventually intersect with Keswick's gravity well. The 5th took 2 rounds from the secondary 5-inch battery. Walsh had rotated his attention to the main threat and delegated the secondary targets, and came apart in a cascade of secondary explosions as its fuel cells ruptured. The 6th fighter, the last, pulled away at maximum speed and ran. McCormick watched it go. "Do we have anything that can chase that?" "No, sir," Reeves said. "Let it go," McCormick said. "Let it go back and tell people what happened here." He turned from the viewport. Iowa's guns were cooling. The gun crews were going through post-fire checks with the methodical care of professionals who understood that the weapon is always the last thing you neglect. Down on the weather deck, someone had started checking the hull for stress fractures from the broadside, which in space was a reasonable concern, and also a very human response to an inhuman environment. Find the thing you know how to check and check it. The outpost on Keswick 4 was hailing the Venture with a mixture of relief and bewilderment, asking what had just happened, what that vessel was, and why its weapons looked like something from a history archive. Sorrel opened a channel to Iowa. "Captain McCormick, the outpost and convoy are secure. Your gunnery was." He paused, which from a Vulcan was its own form of expression. "Effective." "Mr. Walsh sends his regards," McCormick said. "I would like to speak with Mr. Walsh at some point," Sorrel said. His targeting solution was unconventional. "He learned it shooting at zeros over the Pacific," McCormick said. "Turns out the math doesn't care what century it is." In the Jem'Hadar fighter fleeing at maximum warp, the sole survivor of the attack wing composed his report to the Vorder coordinator with the precise, unemotional efficiency of his kind. He described what he had encountered. He described the vessel. He described the weapons. He described the results. The Vorder read the report 3 times. Then he forwarded it to his superiors with a single annotation. "This vessel is not in our database. Its weapons are not in our database. Request immediate intelligence assessment and updated engagement protocols." The report traveled up the Dominion chain of command with the quiet efficiency of a bureaucracy that had learned to take anomalies seriously. It would reach the right ears within hours. And in a Cardassian station on the edge of Dominion space, a figure who had been watching Starfleet's unusual new asset with great interest received a separate intelligence report, not from the Dominion, but from a source considerably closer to Starfleet command, and smiled the specific smile of someone who had been waiting for an opportunity and had just watched one arrive. Iowa had announced herself to the 24th century. The 24th century was beginning to respond. The message arrived on Starbase 4714 hours after the Keswick engagement. It came through a civilian relay, encrypted in a cipher that Starfleet intelligence identified as Obsidian. Order in origin, which was interesting, because the Obsidian Order had been formally dissolved, its infrastructure destroyed, its operatives scattered or dead. Something that no longer existed had sent a message, which meant either that dissolution had been incomplete, or that someone was using the Order's old infrastructure, the way a hermit crab uses a borrowed shell. The message was addressed specifically to Captain John McCormick, USS Iowa, and it read, "Captain, you have demonstrated something the 24th century had forgotten was possible. I have a proposition that may interest a man in your position. I represent parties who can offer what Starfleet cannot, a genuine path home. Meet me on Vela 3 in 48 hours. Come alone or don't come. Either way, I will be there." It was unsigned. McCormick read it twice, folded it, an instinctively 20th century gesture given that it was a digital display, and handed it to Reeves. Reeves read it and said nothing for a moment. Then, Obsidian Order. So they tell me. Cardassian intelligence. Dissolved, but apparently not entirely. Reeves set the display down. It's a trap. Probably, McCormick agreed. You're going anyway. Someone pulled us 400 years out of our time. Frank. Someone did it deliberately, and we still don't know who or why. If there's a thread to pull, McCormick shrugged. A precise, contained gesture. We pull it. He told Admiral Satie about the message. He told her because operational transparency was the foundation of functional military relationships, and because he wanted her to know where he was going in case he didn't come back, and because, though he didn't say this, he wanted to see how she responded. She responded by telling him that Starfleet could not officially sanction contact with Obsidian Order remnants, that Vela 3 was in a politically complicated border region, and that she strongly advised against going. Then she told him that the venture would be conducting a routine survey of the Vela system and would be in communication range throughout his meeting. McCormick nodded. That's a very precise definition of unofficial support, Admiral. Starfleet is good at precise definitions, Satie said. Safe travels, Captain. Vela 3 was a grey world, grey rock, grey sky, grey ocean that moved with the slow, heavy swells of a planet that had given up on being interesting some geological epoch ago. The settlement was a trading post in the most charitable interpretation, a cluster of prefabricated structures around a landing pad, populated by the specific category of beings who preferred to conduct business in locations that asked no questions. McCormick arrived by shuttle, alone as requested, and found his contact already waiting, in a back room of something that was either a bar or a warehouse that had developed ambitions. The figure was Cardassian, grayscaled, precise-featured, with the particular stillness of an intelligence operative who had spent decades learning to occupy space without drawing attention to it. He introduced himself as Derek. He did not offer a rank or affiliation beyond what the message had implied. He poured 2 glasses of something amber and pushed one toward McCormick, who left it where it was. You don't trust the drink, Derek observed. I don't trust the meeting, McCormick said. The drink is just part of the meeting. Derek smiled thinly. Your vessel destroyed 5 Jem'Hadar fighters and crippled a 6th in less than 4 minutes, with weapons that have no energy signature, with a crew that has been in this century for less than a week. He leaned forward slightly. Do you understand how significant that is, Captain? Tell me about the path home, McCormick said. In time. Derek settled back. First, context. The anomaly that brought you here was generated by a device, an experimental piece of technology, assembled from components that originated in at least 4 different species. Research programs, none of whom knew the others were involved. Someone coordinated that assembly very carefully, over a long period of time. Someone who wanted a specific kind of asset dropped into the current conflict at a specific moment. Who? That's the question I've been trying to answer for 8 months. Deck's voice carried the specific frustration of a professional who is accustomed to knowing things and has been denied the satisfaction. What I know is this: whoever did it intended Iowa to be used as a weapon. Not in the way you used it at Keswick. That was your own initiative, your own judgment. They intended something more specific, more destructive. McCormick was quiet for a moment. They wanted to start something. Or accelerate something already started. Deck reached into his coat and produced a data chip, sliding it across the table. This contains the technical specifications of the device that generated the anomaly, partially reconstructed from sensor records, not complete, but enough for your Federation's Temporal Mechanics Division to work with. Tvora will find it useful. Why are you giving me this? Deck considered the question, with the careful attention of a man deciding how much truth is tactically optimal. Because whoever arranged your displacement is operating in the spaces between the major powers: Federation, Dominion, Klingon Empire, Romulan Star Empire. None of them control those spaces completely. My former employers built careers in those spaces. He paused. I have an interest in knowing who is operating in my former territory. You have an interest in going home. The data chip advances both interests. And the path home. The device can be reversed. The same compression technology that pulled you forward can, in theory, push you back. The specifications are on the chip. Deck stood, straightening his coat, with the precise movements of a man, concluding a meeting on his own schedule. Whether the Federation chooses to reconstruct it and use it is their decision. I'd suggest advocating strongly for the option, Captain. This entry has enough complications without adding yours to the list. He walked to the door, then stopped. For what it's worth, what your crew did at Keswick, the way they fought. He didn't turn around. My people have a word for that quality. It doesn't translate well into Federation standard. The closest approximation is something like the courage of those who have nothing left to prove. Your crew has it. He left. McCormick sat alone in the grey room on the grey planet and looked at the data chip for a long moment. Then he pocketed it, stood, and walked back to his shuttle. Tvora worked for 11 hours without pause after receiving the chip, which for a Vulcan was the equivalent of working in a state of barely contained excitement. Her report to Admiral Sati was 47 pages, but the conclusion occupied a single paragraph. The device specifications are viable. Reconstruction is possible within current Federation engineering capabilities. A temporal reversion event could be generated with high probability of successful displacement to the point of origin, within a margin of error of approximately 6 hours in either direction. From Iowa's departure timestamp, crew and vessel would be returned intact. There is no technical obstacle to proceeding. The decision is not a scientific one. Sati called McCormick to her office. She had the report on her desk. She had also, McCormick noticed, cleared everything else off the desk, which he interpreted as her way of indicating that this was the only thing that mattered right now. Tvora can send you home, she said. So I understand. The Temporal Mechanics Division has concerns about timeline contamination. The JAG office has concerns about precedent. 3 separate admirals have already contacted me with concerns about the strategic implications of Iowa's demonstrated combat effectiveness and what it means for our relationship with the Dominion. She folded her hands. I have cut all of them off and told them this decision belongs to you and your crew. McCormick looked at her. Does it? You didn't ask to come here. You didn't ask to fight at Keswick, though I'll note that the outpost survivors are rather glad you did. You didn't ask to be placed in the middle of a political situation that was complicated before you arrived and is considerably more complicated now. Sati held his gaze. The Federation is not in the business of conscripting people from other centuries. If there is a way home, Captain, it is your way to take or leave. McCormick thought about his crew. 2,700 men who had followed him into a century that wasn't theirs and performed with a professionalism that had made Sorrel pause and a Klingon commander reassess and a Cardassian intelligence operative reach for a word that didn't translate. Men who had families in 1944. Men who had a war of their own to finish. A war that mattered. That was still being decided. That needed every ship and every gun it could get. He thought about Keswick. 4. About the outpost crew who were alive. Because Iowa had been in the path of something that would have killed them. About the convoy that had reached its destination. About the 6th Jem'Hadar fighter carrying word of something unprecedented back to people who would now have to account for it in their calculations. He thought about Dek's word. The courage of those who have nothing left to prove. How long does Tvora need to build the device? He asked. 72 hours. McCormick nodded. Then we have 72 hours. He stood. I'd like Iowa to spend them here, at the station. My crew has earned some time that isn't a crisis. And I'd like Sorrel to join us for dinner, if he's willing. I owe him a proper conversation. Sati almost smiled. I'll pass that along. McCormick walked to the door, then stopped, a gesture that felt, in its way, like an echo of Dek's earlier exit. Admiral, whoever pulled us here wanted to use us as a weapon. They may try again, with something else, something less manageable. I know, Sati said quietly. Find them, McCormick said. It was not a request. It was not quite an order. It was the specific communication of one senior officer to another, crossing every boundary of rank and century, carrying the weight of someone who understood exactly what was at stake and trusted that the person across from them understood it too. He left. Iowa waited at her berth, grey and vast and permanent looking against the clean lines of the starbase, her hull carrying the slight charge residue of guns recently fired, her crew moving across her decks with the unhurried rhythm of professionals between engagements. She looked like she had always been there. She looked like she would always be there. She would not. In 72 hours she would go home. Back to her ocean, back to her war, back to the precise moment she had left so that they, 2,700 men aboard her could finish the work they had started. But for 72 hours, she was here. And the 24th century, which had seen a great many things, had never seen anything quite like her. They sent Iowa home on a Tuesday morning, station time, with no ceremony. McCormick had asked for it that way. No speeches, no commemorations, no holographic recordings for the Federation archive, though Tvora made those anyway, quietly, and filed them under a classification level that would not be opened for 200 years. The crew of Iowa assembled at their stations, ran their pre-departure checks, and waited with the focused calm of men who had learned, in the past week, that the universe was considerably larger and stranger than anyone in 1944 had imagined, and who had decided that this was interesting rather than terrifying. Sorrel's voice came over the comm channel from Aventure, which was maintaining escort position. Captain McCormick, it has been an education. Commander Sorrel, McCormick said. Same. Take care of this galaxy. It needs it. We endeavor to, Sorrel said. And then, with the precise deliberateness of a Vulcan who has decided that a thing is worth saying, your crew is extraordinary, Captain, by any century's measure. The temporal device activated. The anomaly opened, a circle of compressed light and folded space, vast enough to swallow Iowa whole. The great ship moved forward into it without hesitation. Guns forward, flags flying, 2,700 men at their posts. And then she was gone. The anomaly closed. The space where Iowa had been was empty and quiet, marked only by the faint residual energy signature of displaced time. Sorrel stood at his viewport for a long moment. Helm, he said finally. Resume course. Somewhere in 1944, an ocean received its ship back. The war continued. History held its shape. And in a sealed Federation archive, a record waited patiently for their century when someone would be allowed to read it and learn what Iowa had done. The Federation would not forget.